Welcome to Exhausting Stories, where history helps you drift into sleep. Tonight, we journey to a land once considered the richest on earth, a place where the throne shimmered with diamonds and gold passed through bazaars like silk through fingers. Under the Mughals, India held nearly a quarter of the world's wealth, its cities thriving, its culture blooming, its people proud. But what changed wasn't the clash of armies, it was something quieter. A fleet of ships arrived not with cannons, but with contracts. The British East India Company came as merchants, offering trade and treaties, but slowly, steadily, they became rulers. What followed was a long unraveling, not of spirit, but of sovereignty. Wealth was drained, traditions rewritten, and a golden age dimmed under foreign rule. And yet, through it all, something endured. Tonight, as the fire crackles and the world slows around you, we'll step back into the story of India, the world's richest country, and how it came to be ruled by a crown far across the sea. So close your eyes and let history whisper you to sleep. Also, please like and subscribe to the channel. It really helps us develop more stories. Thank you, and let's begin. Step into the teeming bazaars of Agra, where the air is thick with the scent of saffron, cardamom, and spice-laden heat. Sunlight filters through silk awnings in a kaleidoscope of color, glinting off bolts of fabric so fine they shimmer like water. Merchants shout above the din, their stalls overflowing with jewels, hand-woven cottons, and silks so light they seem to defy gravity. The streets pulse with energy as caravans from distant deserts and ships from far-off European ports converge, all drawn by the magnetic pull of India's legendary wealth. At the dawn of the 18th century, India stood as a titan of global wealth. Its economy powered nearly a quarter of the world's GDP, more than all of Europe combined. Gold, spices, silks, and cotton flowed through its veins, feeding a civilization of bustling cities, glittering palaces, and fertile farmlands. Britain, by comparison, was a mere shadow, contributing just 3% to global output, barely a ripple in the vast current of trade. But India's riches weren't hidden behind palace walls. They coursed through daily life, in markets and ports, aboard caravans and ships, stretching from the deserts of Rajasthan to the harbors of Bengal. India wasn't just part of the global economy, it was its heartbeat, bold, booming, and irresistible. From the emerald riverbanks of Bengal in the east, to the thriving harbors of Gujarat along India's western Arabian sea coast, ships set sail, heavy with treasures, their hulls packed with silks, spices, and cottons, bound for markets from Cairo to London. Among the most prized, muslin, a fabric so fine and sheer it was known as woven air. Spun from the softest cotton and hand-woven with astonishing precision, it could pass through a ring, yet command the admiration of emperors. Traveling alongside it were block-printed textiles, bursting with intricate patterns and vibrant dyes, destined to adorn homes from Istanbul to Paris. These were not merely goods, they were masterpieces of craftsmanship, each one a whisper of India's culture, its artistry, and its soul. The world didn't just want India's exports, it craved them. Minion's sea economic power didn't flow from a single throne. It surged through a mosaic of thriving regions. In the early 1700s, the subcontinent was home to an estimated 150 to 200 million people, nearly a quarter of the world's population. But this wasn't the India of today. Instead, the region stretched across what is now India, Pakistan, Bangladesh, and parts of Afghanistan, ruled not by one unified government, but by a network of regional powers under the fading shadow of the Mughal Empire. At the symbolic center stood the imperial Mughal court in Delhi, a dazzling vision of wealth and order. Foreign visitors spoke in awe of its splendor, gold-paneled halls, fountains carved from marble, and the legendary peacock throne, glittering with diamonds, rubies, and emeralds. Yet true power and prosperity radiated outward. Local rulers governed their territories like sovereign kings, nurturing industries, supporting artisans, and maintaining complex irrigation systems perfected over centuries. In Bengal, a lush region in the east, weavers produced muslin so fine it was called woven air, a fabric so delicate it could pass through a ring, and so coveted that European traders risked shipwrecks to obtain it. In Gujarat, a coastal gem in the west, craftsmen transformed cotton into block-printed masterpieces dyed in colors that seemed to defy time. Across the land, farmers cultivated rice, wheat, and sugarcane, feeding not just cities, but entire empires. India's wealth pulsed not only through its palaces, but through the shipyards of Surat in western India, the spice markets of Kerala along the southwestern Malabar coast, and the crowded wharves of Calcutta in the eastern Ganges delta. It was a decentralized web of ambition and artistry, where power was shared, not hoarded. This was not chaos. It was a civilization in motion, a continent-sized engine of trade, culture, and innovation. And it was this very vibrancy that would soon draw the gaze of foreign powers, eager to claim a piece for themselves. And then there was the Taj Mahal, not merely a building, but a vision in stone, rising like a dream from the banks of the Yamuna River. Commissioned in 1631 by Emperor Shah Jahan, who ruled from 1628 to 1658, it was built in memory of his beloved wife, Mumtaz Mahal. The monument's luminous white marble came from Makrana, a region in Rajasthan, northwest India, renowned for producing some of the purest and most enduring marble in the world. Its inlaid gemstones were sourced from distant lands, and its construction required more than 20,000 artisans over 2 decades. The Taj is more than a tomb. It is a monument to an era when art, empire, and emotion converged. Even today, it endures not only as a symbol of eternal love, but as a shimmering testament to a civilization at the peak of its creative and economic power. India's influence didn't end with trade. The nation thrived in science, mathematics, and the arts. Under visionary rulers like Maharaja Jai Singh II of Jaipur, who reigned from 1699 to 1743, monumental observatories rose in cities like Delhi, Jaipur, and Ujjain, built to chart the stars and refine the calendar with astonishing accuracy. Though not an emperor, Jai Singh was a Rajput king with a passion for astronomy and learning, bridging ancient Indian knowledge with Islamic and European techniques. Across the subcontinent, poets and scholars filled royal courts, writing in Persian, Urdu, Bengali, and Marathi. Their works delved into medicine, mathematics, philosophy, and cosmology, weaving India into a global web of ideas. This was a civilization not only of wealth, but of wisdom, and its intellectual reach extended far beyond its borders. But such brilliance was not hidden. It glowed, and that glow was seen from across the seas. European powers, drawn by stories of India's abundance, arrived one after another. Portuguese, Dutch, French, and finally the British. At first they came as merchants, eager for spices and silks. The Mughal rulers saw them as guests, outsiders on the edges of a thriving empire. Their presence, though noticeable, was not seen as a threat. But these visitors were watching. The British East India Company, arriving late but observing closely, began modestly, with trading posts in places like Surat, a bustling port city on India's western coast in present-day Gujarat. English wool for Indian goods, simple contracts, polite diplomacy. Yet behind this seemingly harmless exterior, company agents watched carefully. They mapped the political fractures, noted the rivalries between regional kings, and studied the fragile threads holding the vast Mughal realm together. What began as commerce was quietly becoming strategy. India's prosperity was immense, but it was not invincible. The same decentralized system that had once fueled innovation also created cracks, openings that could be exploited. Local rulers with regional ambitions, disputes between provinces, shifting alliances, these would become the levers of influence. The British learned quickly. They offered protection, brokered peace, and slowly traded goods for power. And as the 18th century unfolded, India's golden age continued on the surface. Bustling bazaars, crowded ports, vibrant markets. But beneath, the foundation was shifting. Trade was no longer just trade. The line between commerce and control was beginning to blur. Soon, the sight of foreign sails approaching India's shores would no longer bring curiosity, but consequence. What began as a partnership of markets was becoming something else entirely. Ships appeared on the horizon, their sails taut with wind as they drifted toward the bustling ports of India's coastline. Places like Surat, where the scent of spice hung thick in the air. But these vessels carried more than cargo. They carried the quiet ambitions of Europe's rising empires. Among them, the British East India Company, one of many hungry competitors, arrived in the early 1600s with modest intentions, or so it seemed. They came bearing wool and silver, eager to trade for silks, spices, and cotton that shimmered with the wealth of the East. But behind every ledger and cargo hold was something deeper, the first ripple of a tide that would one day try to swallow the subcontinent. At first, their presence was barely a whisper. The Mughal emperors, who ruled most of India with splendor and confidence, saw the English as little more than another group of foreign merchants, useful but insignificant. In 1618, they granted the British limited concessions, including the right to establish a small trading outpost in Surat. But the company's agents were not ordinary traders. They were patient, calculating, and relentless. Behind every polite bow and carefully worded petition was a deeper ambition: to turn a single foothold into a lever of power. Because they understood one truth: in a land as vast and rich as India, even the smallest crack could one day split an empire. The company's early years in India were a masterclass in quiet ambition. Its agents moved carefully, studying the rhythms of the Mughal court, learning when to flatter, when to gift, and when to simply observe. They bowed low, offered fine English goods, and spoke with measured humility, all while their eyes scanned the room. Around them, other European powers, the Portuguese, the Dutch, the French, competed for access, each trying to carve out their share of India's unimaginable wealth. But the English soon grasped a deeper truth: trade alone would never be enough. Success in India meant mastering its political labyrinth, a shifting web of local rulers, fragile alliances, and ancient rivalries. Though the Mughal emperor reigned from Delhi in gilded splendor, his grip on distant provinces was already loosening, and in those cracks, the company found its chance. They offered military aid to embattled kings, loans to desperate nawabs, and promises to ambitious generals, each deal a thread, slowly woven into a net of influence. What began as commerce was quietly evolving into something far more dangerous: control. By 1640, the company took a bold step. On India's southeastern coast, they secured land to build Fort St. George, a walled enclave that would one day grow into the city of Chennai, then known as Madras. It was more than just a trading post. It was their first permanent stronghold in southern India, a fortified symbol of growing ambition. Here, they no longer had to rely solely on the goodwill of local rulers. They could manage trade on their own terms, fly their flag, and guard their growing fortunes. With each new outpost, the company shed its mask of modesty. It grew bolder, more strategic, no longer just a guest in India, but a power with a foothold and a plan. Every stone laid at Fort St. George echoed a deeper intent. They weren't just here to trade. They were here to stay. What set the company apart was its uncanny ability to adapt. In regions where Mughal authority had begun to fray, they moved swiftly, offering protection to local rulers in exchange for loyalty. The pitch was simple: we'll defend you from your enemies, just give us control of the trade routes. To leaders threatened by rival kingdoms or internal unrest, it sounded like salvation. In return, the company claimed exclusive rights to valuable goods, quietly tightening its grip. At first, these deals looked like partnerships, Rulers gained powerful allies, the company gained local access, but over time the balance shifted. The promises of protection turned into terms of control, the allies became clients, and the once independent rulers who thought they were using the company realized too late they had become dependent on it. What began as diplomacy was quickly morphing into quiet domination. By the 18th century, the company was no longer content to trade. It was preparing to rule. Its leaders understood that commerce alone couldn't secure power in a land as vast and contested as India. So they made a decisive move. They built an army. Not just any army, but one composed largely of Indian soldiers, known as sepoys, drilled and commanded by European officers. What began as a protective force quickly grew into a war machine. By 1800, the company had over 200,000 Indian troops under its command, a private army larger than many national militaries. With this force at its back, the company no longer had to ask politely. It could enforce its will, whether across negotiating tables or on the battlefield. The merchant had become a warlord, and India was its prize. The turning point came in 1757, on the rain-slicked fields near Plassey. There, the Nawab of Bengal, Siraj-ud-Dowlah, the powerful regional ruler of Bengal, India's richest province, led a massive army against the growing threat of the British East India Company. In the Mughal tradition, a Nawab was more than just a governor. He was a king in all but name, controlling vast revenues, armies and influence. On paper, Siraj-ud-Dowlah should have won, but the company played a different game. Robert Clive, leading the smaller British force, had struck a secret deal with Mir Jafar, one of the Nawab's top commanders. As the battle raged, Mir Jafar and his troops stood still, watching in silence. The betrayal was complete. Isolated and outmaneuvered, Siraj-ud-Dowlah's forces collapsed. What followed was more than a victory, it was a transformation. With Bengal's wealth now in British hands, the East India Company moved from merchant to monarch. Plassey was not just a battlefield, it was the birthplace of British rule in India. After Plassey, the company's rise was no longer gradual, it was explosive. In 1765, the Treaty of Allahabad marked a turning point. It granted the British East India Company the right to collect taxes, known as Diwani, across Bengal, Bihar, and Orissa. With a single stroke of ink, a merchant company had become a governing power. The company was no longer a foreign guest in Indian markets. It now ruled over millions, commanding the wealth of entire provinces. Bengal, with its fertile soil, dense population, and thriving trade networks, became the engine of British ambition. Its revenue paid for soldiers, funded expansion, and bankrolled an empire. The East India Company, born in boardrooms and trading posts, now stood as a political force, and India would never be the same. The company's new power came at a devastating cost. In their pursuit of maximum profit, company officials reshaped India's economy to serve British interests. They imposed harsh trade restrictions, funneling raw materials, especially cotton, out of India and into Britain's booming textile mills. In return, the Indian market was flooded with cheap, machine-made British goods, undercutting the local artisans who had once clothed emperors and nobles. Bengal's legendary textile industry, once the pride of the subcontinent and the envy of the world, began to wither. Indian weavers, who had passed down their craft for generations, now watched their looms fall silent. Entire families were pushed into poverty. Towns that once thrived on hand-woven brilliance slipped into decline. What the company built in revenue, it drained in soul, turning vibrant economies into shadows of their former selves. The company's grip was no longer held by trade. It was enforced at the barrel of a gun. Where once it had courted alliances with local rulers, it now relied on its growing private army to impose order and crush dissent. Forts that had begun as humble trading posts were transformed into heavily armed strongholds, casting long shadows over the lands they once merely visited. Company officials moved swiftly to replace or manipulate regional leaders, ensuring that every throne, every council, served British interests above all. Treaties were redrafted, their language twisted from partnership to subjugation. What had started as cooperation was now control, calculated, cold, and absolute. As the company's authority tightened, the shockwaves tore through Indian society. With traditional industries collapsing under the weight of British imports, millions were pushed into poverty. Farmers, once sustained by generations of steady cultivation, now faced crushing taxes and foreign land policies that tore apart age-old rhythms of rural life. The company didn't govern for India. It governed for profit, answering to shareholders in London, not the people of the land it ruled. Policies were drafted not for stability or justice, but for maximum extraction. Villages that had once thrived became hollow. The social and economic fabric that had supported India's prosperity for centuries began to fray and fall apart, thread by thread. And yet, even as the British East India Company tightened its grip, India was not yet fully conquered. In the late 18th and early 19th centuries, vast stretches of the subcontinent still lay under the rule of independent kings, nawabs, and princes. The company had carved out a formidable presence in Bengal and beyond, but its reach depended not just on force. It relied on a fragile web of treaties, alliances, and diplomacy. But the balance of power had shifted. These local rulers, once sovereign in their domains, now ruled under the shadow of British troops and company officials. Their decisions were second-guessed, their autonomy chipped away by demands, directives, and veiled threats. The crown still sat on Indian heads, but it was the company that now pulled the strings behind the throne. The transformation of the East India Company from merchant to monarch was not sudden, but it was unstoppable. Step by step, deal by deal, the company reshaped its identity. It adapted with cunning precision, deploying diplomacy when it served, military force when it must, and economic pressure whenever it could. The lines between trader and tyrant began to blur. Forts turned into capitals, contracts became commands, and profit gave way to power. What had once worn the mask of commerce now revealed the face of empire, and the company's true ambitions were no longer hidden. They were unfolding, one province at a time. This evolution was not the end, it was the prologue to something even greater. As the company's rule deepened and its reach extended into every corner of Indian life, a troubling question began to emerge. What happens when a private corporation is handed the powers of a sovereign state? The answer would ripple far beyond balance sheets and trade routes. This was no longer just a shift in governance. It was a transformation that would remake India's economy, unravel its social fabric, and reshape its culture for generations to come. The East India Company was no longer just doing business. It was redefining the empire itself. What happens when a company becomes a government? The East India Company began as a merchant venture, but transformed into the ruler of much of India. In 1857, that rule was shattered by rebellion. The spark came when Indian sepoys refused to bite rifle cartridges rumoured to be greased with cow and pig fat, an insult to both Hindu and Muslim faiths. But this was about more than grease. It was about years of discrimination, land seizures, and cultural disrespect. The rebellion spread like wildfire. Peasants, landowners, and dethroned rulers joining forces under the aging Mughal emperor Bahadur Shah Zafar. They fought not for conquest, but for dignity, land, and home rule. The company struck back with merciless force, leaving cities like Delhi in ruins. By 1858, the company's power was gone, replaced by direct British Crown rule, the birth of the Raj. The Raj promised reform, but refined the machinery of exploitation. Taxes consumed half or more of a farmer's harvest, pushing millions into debt. India's industries, especially textiles, were dismantled. Raw cotton was shipped to Britain, while cheap British cloth flooded Indian markets. Railways and telegraphs, hailed as progress, existed to move goods to ports, not to connect communities. Cultural domination followed. English replaced regional languages in schools and courts, while colonial education devalued Indian knowledge. Yet the same system bred a generation fluent in the language of empire and in the ideals of liberty, who began to challenge British rule. Meanwhile, famine stalked the land. Policies favored export crops over food, so when drought struck, millions starved even as grain shipments left for Britain. The 19th century ended with India's share of global wealth collapsed, its once vibrant cities hollowed. In 1877, Queen Victoria was crowned Empress of India, a crown forged from conquest and extraction. Beneath it all, India's spirit endured, its languages, customs, and quiet resistance flowing beneath the machinery of empire. The wealth was gone, shipped away in crates and ledger lines, but the will to endure remained. And in that endurance, the seeds of freedom had already begun to grow. The drain of wealth was no metaphor. It was a system that bled India dry. Every tax, every policy, every trade deal funneled riches into Britain's coffers, leaving India stripped of prosperity. The land was the first target. Farmers surrendered half to 4/5 of their harvest value before the grain even ripened. Debt replaced relief, and famine became a constant shadow. Revenue flowed overseas, funding British wars and industries, while India's wells, roads, and schools crumbled. Agriculture was reshaped for empire. Fields once growing food now produced cotton, indigo, opium, and tea for foreign markets. One failed crop meant ruin. Famines, like those of 1876-78 and Bengal in 1943, killed millions, even as grain was exported. Industry, too, was gutted. India's famed textiles, unmatched for centuries, were crushed under tariffs and flooded by cheap British imports. Skilled artisans became beggars. Proud workshops fell silent. By 1947, India's share of global GDP had plummeted from 24% in 1700 to under 3%. Dadabhai Naoroji's expose proved poverty was not fate, it was policy. British gifts like railways and telegraphs were built to speed exports, not feed the people. Yet, beneath the hunger and loss, India's spirit endured, its will to resist quietly growing, even as the machinery of empire ground on. Even as Britain stripped India's wealth, its traditions, languages, and arts endured. The British imposed laws, dress codes, and schools, but identity adapted. Spoken in a mother tongue, sung in a folk ballad, or worn in a sari against the tide of Western suits. English education, meant to serve colonial needs, also armed Indians with the tools to question empire. Writers kept Bengali, Hindi, Tamil, and Urdu alive. Stories and poems became quiet acts of defiance. The Bengal Renaissance fused reform with tradition, while Tagore's words carried Indian voices to the world. Resistance lived in craft and ritual. Gandhi's spinning wheel and khadi cloth turned clothing into protest, each thread a refusal to feed the empire's mills. Folk epics and village festivals flourished beyond colonial reach, nurturing pride and unity. These cultural roots fueled political awakening. From cautious petitions to mass movements, Indians wove language, art, and tradition into the struggle for self-rule. When independence came in 1947, India bore deep scars, but its spirit had not only survived, it had grown strong enough to rebuild. History so often glorifies the conquerors, their ships cutting across oceans, their armies marching in perfect step, their flags raised over foreign lands. But beneath the thunder of cannons and the glitter of empire lies a quieter truth, the truth of those who endured. India, once the world's richest civilization, endured centuries of deliberate extraction. Its fields were emptied, its industries dismantled, its treasures carried away to adorn foreign palaces. Jewels vanished into royal vaults, silks crossed oceans to feed foreign markets, and gold flowed endlessly into another nation's coffers. Yet, even as wealth drained away, something greater refused to be taken. The songs, the languages, the rituals, and the quiet pride of a people survived the long night of empire. They passed through generations not as fragile relics, but as living embers, kept alive in whispered stories, in the rhythm of the spinning wheel, in the colours of a sari worn against the tide of imposed fashion. Empires rise and fall, but the spirit of a people endures. And in that endurance lies a victory more lasting than conquest. As you let your eyes grow heavy, remember this. The story of India under British rule is not just one of loss. It is one of remarkable survival. The wealth may have been carried off in ships, but the heart of the land never left its people. Cultural resilience doesn't vanish. It bends, it shifts, it takes on new forms in memory and in daily life. So tonight, as you drift toward dreams, imagine the hum of a spinning wheel in a quiet village, the scent of spices on a market breeze, the sound of poetry recited under a starlit sky. These are the threads that outlast empires. And perhaps, before sleep takes you, you might reflect, from this story, woven through struggle and survival, do you find most inspiring? Please like and subscribe, as it helps exhausting stories make new stories.